Hi, friends. I'm Rachel. I live in Essex, in Dedham. Does anyone know where that is? Anyone been? Constable country? Come on, you Essex birds. I am married to an eccentric classic car buyer called Rob, who used to work in insurance. My mum actually thinks that I work for Aon, so if anyone can educate her that Aon and Aon are quite different. And it just so happens I'm also Aon's first global chief wellbeing officer. And I've been listening to everybody's conversations today, and also I just wanted to start off by describing my role, because it's just probably a little bit unique. So I actually think about Aon as an organization with 50,000 colleagues across 120 different countries. So I very much am responsible for how do you create change around well-being in that type of environment. The other interesting thing is that the second half of my role is working with clients globally on what well-being can mean and where does Aon have the right to play. So you might know bits about what we're up to in the world. We have part of us that is in wealth, so naturally financial health is part of that story. We have a human capital practice, so rewards, compensation, etc. And we also have probably the more known, which is our health and benefits practice. And I'm interested in the dots between, not the individual propositions, and then ultimately creating the market. Where do we have the right to play? And I'm not going to touch too much on that second half, because I think in light of what everyone's talked about today, it's been brilliant and quite theoretical. So I thought I'd just focus on what we're doing at Aon as a nice example of how do you start to weave some of the theory into practical jobs that we all have. And so hopefully there's nods in the room. Hopefully there's a good sense of release and a little bit of a shift of the agenda. And before I go into that detail, I just also want to say, thank you. This room is what's changing the agenda at the moment. And I don't know about anyone else. I haven't quite figured out how not to be knackered. So this is all part of, a big round of applause to everybody. And I'm probably focusing on a few things that are different to what's been described already from what I've heard today. So I thought we'd dive into that. But before we do, should we stand up? Just to test anyone who dared to wear heels post-pandemic. I have one simple question, because what we've heard as a sort of precursor to this event, and I think maybe there was some smart curation as we go, but surely there is an ROI, a linkage with well-being and performance. And surely now we're all shifting to data first. But visualize your CEO. Think of the reality of what well-being means in his or her head. Please stay standing if you genuinely believe that your CEO understands that being more human is good for business. Sit down if you don't think that's the case. So that's actually, as a litmus test, pretty good. So I'll follow it up even further. How many of you are reporting on well-being in your annual reports? Please stay standing. Round of applause to all of you. How many of your executive team are being remunerated based on well-being? As an incentivized to do so. So really interesting. Thank you very much, you three. One Aon example, so kind of doesn't count. But you can suddenly see by those questions, we are, as well-being advocates, we're very much following the coattails of sustainability and diversity. And where have the big shifts happened? And it's all about organizational design. So I'm going to take you on the narrative. I'm 15 months into role. I had the joy of having Aon as a client a little bit, so it's a little bit of a cheat to say I've only known Aon for 15 months. But I'm going to describe exactly what I've done in that 15 months. Definitely going to allow, as I step back from the clock, because I haven't been for an eye test since the pandemic, so suddenly, moments like that, you need to step back. So I want to take you through, starting with the end in mind. We know all this stuff, but sometimes it's quite nice just to take a snapshot with your phone. Context is, really interestingly, Helen and I chat globally to clients on this stuff. America still think they're leading, question mark over that. UK is actually far more advanced in many areas of well-being. And we should be shouting about that. We also know this stuff. So if you think about the key concoction of ingredients that we could start to accelerate this agenda on, and the shift that's happened in the last 2 years, now is the time. So as I came into Aon 15 months ago, how did I start to think about what single thing I could do to make an impact? What I thought was really clear, and again, anyone from Aon, please shoot me down on this is not correct, we were doing good things for individuals. We had sometimes global ecosystems, sometimes local ecosystems if there was a cultural nuance. And there's nothing necessarily that I need to disrupt on that layer. But we were doing absolutely nothing around designing that individual journey into the organization itself. So something we call team sustainability and organizational sustainability. And I'll come on to the difference within that. But this concoction of ultimately talent risk and the appreciation that well-being is now part of that risk agenda is great for us. So we don't have to kind of argue anymore that this is good for us, but it's the plugging in that is really the important bit now. So the traditional mechanisms of employee value proposition are great. All I'm trying to do now is go that layer beneath to say, and what does this mean for meaning and purpose? And what does this mean for emotional health, for mental health, for community, and other things? So what we've started to do is actually use, and I know there's some questions earlier about can you measure this stuff? Well, first off, what are we trying to measure? So there were 5 things that I brought, which I'll just talk to, again, might be nice notes. But number 1 is updating our framework on what well-being means at Aon. So you could probably just see at the bottom, there's actually 3 parts to our framework now. And we talk about that language, and I've realized as you go from 1 to 3, I need to use different words, because different people are owning those things. So absolutely number 1, akin to everybody else, we expanded our pillars of well-being around the individual component. Fantastic. We're also getting super, super clear that as an individual, David, you own your well-being. Managers own the team component, and leaders own the organizational component. Sounds super simple, but all of that's quite muddy when I first joined Aon. Because what role does a business resource group play? What role does a well-being champion play? What role does someone who's had MHFA training play? Actually, they're all feeding number 1. None of them are really deeply thinking about 2 or 3. So for me, when we start to then say this is our new framework, I mapped out all of our data sources. Some were good, some were pretty patchy, some I really struggled to get in the same format from our ecosystem of providers. But I said if we're going to embed this strategy, we need data sets that sit under each 3 pillars. And we start to say what we have on the individual side is ill-being data, not well-being data. Great, a great acknowledgement. And then how do we start to go on a journey of building out individual data? Add some questions to our engagement survey. Do some pulses specifically on that. And then from there, how do we get even closer? Because 2 questions don't really scratch the surface. And that's where, on the sort of roller tape at the top, we now use an assessment tool called the Human Sustainability Index at that individual layer to measure targeted groups, all of these components together, which for Aon, in our engagement survey and our pulse survey, we realized was our new colleagues, we could start to see that resiliency was decreasing by 20 to 30% 12 months into Aon life, and that was linked to attrition. We can also see a risk point around midlife, so whether that's a return from a leave of absence, a maternity or a pat leave, and we also see risk with our high performers, and we're accidentally rewarding burnout behavior at the moment. So we now capture this type of granular data, and I'm going to give you the results on the next slide, for those 3 populations, and that's 10,000 colleagues. It's a significant data set. And what's interesting is the process isn't just a diagnostic, you get self-coaching. All of those groups get a year's worth of community coaching to start to actually enable people to become self-sufficient. And obviously our ecosystem of resources support are very much hugging that approach. Might sound like if I was speaking to an Aon colleague, like quite dull stuff. Actually, the user experience, what is that feeling like for a human? But this is the only way we've started to then think about number 2 and number 3. And accelerating, so the second chapter of the index talks about team resiliency. So I'm not talking about manager training around mental health. I'm talking about, as a manager, what levers do you need to understand impact sustainable performance? So this is ways of working. This is which behaviors do I now need to applaud when we're all bruised post-pandemic. This is about thinking about skills that we invest in and how do we, okay, great, Helen can do this job, but how does she have the resiliency to apply it at this stage of life? All of this comes together as a whole new skill set for managers. And we have that data for each manager that they can then understand what they need to focus on at a point in time. Sounds simple, but that's the organizational embedding. And then the third one, we start to aggregate all of that up for the board. And it's taken a journey. We're not using well-being in the language yet. Maybe we never will. We're using talent sustainability. Completely resonates. And again, I'm not just telling the well-being story there, because I don't actually think that's the right thing to do. I don't want to be a single champion with a flag. We're telling that concoction of the ways that we choose to work, the performance data, the diversity data, and the well-being data to inform a more mature conversation around talent. And so last Thursday, we had our first formal report to the board on this. So it was a big moment for us, and partly driven by the market, interestingly. As the last 2 quarterly earnings calls prior to that, we got asked questions around our engagement, and they quickly got squashed, and it was so what? Engagement and mental health and well-being and what else? So now we can start to help our leadership team have the right ingredients to respond to it with data. So if anything, just have in your mind, if you do want to start to think about these 3 pillars, mapping out the data, mapping out your efforts, I wouldn't be surprised if most of us are staying in the individual at the moment. And so for me, it's far more about using the data to be very specific. We've actually taken quite a lot away on the individual level and started to be very focused. And the way that we can do that is by, hopefully no one's colorblind, because it's quite tricky to understand the rainbow here. But you start to, by group, by age, by whatever generationally or however you want to start to slice and dice it, this gives you your roadmap on what to focus on. So every quarter we have this data, and we pivot our focus. We pivot the focus of our global partners. So for me, I've actually chosen not to build out a well-being team, which might sound controversial, because I thought that would just ultimately psychologically feel like Rachel's team will catch all of this. No, you're catching this. I'm going to empower you with the data to build it into your roles. So this data gets pushed through global learning and development. This data gets pushed through talent acquisition. This data gets pushed through our global benefits strategy. And again, it's not me owning the delivery, it's me owning the thinking and the data to then inform the what next. And that then becomes your EVP, sort of accidentally. So again, I think if you have heard about Aon, it's probably not dissimilar. We talk about diversity, flexible working, we call it smart working, and well-being as our differentiators. But actually, this is what helps bring those things to life. I'm just going to also tell a story at this point, because I think we can probably afford a 30-second story. It's a diversity link. So what we started to realize is when you give managers these sorts of data sets, and then start to implant that and upskill them in what to do with it. When you're trying to say, well, come on, please, can we also cultivate a sense of belonging and inclusion? Sometimes you find that managers, that's not a natural tendency, are really kind of grappling with, well, how do I actually start to make change around that? And for some teams, especially in certain roles, we can see biases of skill sets against 3 of these pathways, and complete absence of skill sets in others. And then you start to dissect that by generation, and it's even more stark. And so it becomes like a map of what skill sets are we missing, who might we want to recruit, not just based on the fact that they can perform wonderful magic on an Excel spreadsheet, but also based on the gaps and behaviors around human sustainability. So this is where the team thinking really comes into play. We also started to understand that actually our early careers, we were making the assumption that they are all struggling with financial health. And we've done some really solid things around that. But the data started to tell us it was actually more about mental health and actually have no idea how to be effective in a hybrid world. That was their challenge. It was definitely underpinned by financial, but the immediacy of then being able to have that to navigate what to implement was really useful for us. So for 50,000 colleagues, we are now rolling this out. We have a little bit of a secret plan to eventually replace our engagement survey with this, because this is ultimately the real engagement data that we're interested in, whole humans in an organization. And then again, coming back to those pillars, but the organization has the right to play in the team in the organizational space. And we then support people to understand how to manage this in the right way. I don't necessarily think, we can talk about EVP, we can talk about IVP, we can talk about HVP, individual, human, but there is a sense of personalization, isn't there? So rather than do more, do it better in a more unique way. And I think what's most interesting is almost taking that kind of data that I had up there before and starting to think about practical application to personas. That's how we've translated it. All of our comms now go through personas. Smart working, diversity, well-being sit under personas. I'm conscious that there are 3 minutes left. Our assessments now have resiliency and well-being embedded in. It's another example. I think it might be useful to pause and ask for questions at that point. So hopefully you're getting new types of data, weaving it in, shifting the agenda up to team and organization. That seems to be, for us, the key as to how we pivot and started making different impact.